Subscribe to my channel and hit that notification button. Shalom.
WSJ's special writer, Betsy McKay, joins us now to discuss. Thanks for being here, Betsy.
Thanks for having me.
As you point out in your piece, this trend is shocking for an economically advanced country like the United States. What is driving the uptick in deaths?
Well, this is a really interesting study, and it follows on some work done about a year and a half ago by the same two economists at Princeton, which found that mortality was rising among middle-aged Americans. So then they set out to figure out a couple of things. One, how widespread was that problem? And secondly, what might be driving it? So what they found in their new paper is that mortality is rising not just for middle-aged Americans, but for Americans between 25 and 64 years of age. And what's driving that really is our rises in mortality in people who have a high school education or less, so working class Americans. For people with a college degree, mortality is still declining. So to have mortality rise in a developed nation is very, very unusual. And we've our mortality rates have been declining for decades.
Right.
They posit a hypothesis which is really interesting. They examined a ton of data, economic data, health data, from national sources, and what they believe is going on is that the types of jobs available to working class Americans have changed since the 70s. They're less stable, more minimum wage jobs, less opportunity for advancement, and at the same time there are a lot of social trends: decline in marriage, more cohabitation, more children born out of wedlock, more social isolation, families aren't stable.
Right, and so you touched on education and also the workforce. These deaths of despair, especially with the opioid crisis we've seen in America, they believe are leading more white adults to die younger. Is that correct?
That's correct, and they do point out that these trends were underway before the opioid epidemic took off. I mean, opioids were really introduced in the 90s, and the epidemic has kind of taken off in the 2000s, whereas changes were starting to occur, before the mid-90s. But the opioid epidemic has definitely accelerated it. And then on top of that, you have alcohol-related liver diseases, and you have suicide. Suicide and opioids are often tied. It's hard to tell sometimes whether a drug overdose was intentional or accidental.
Right. Well, it's also interesting because these studies always look at race. And here the researchers found that blacks and Hispanics face many of the same income struggles as the white working class, yet they've experienced a decline in mortality rates. So how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, well, so that's the puzzle for everyone. What they say is that for whites, for working class whites, times were better earlier. So in other words, there was an expectation, more of an expectation of life improving. Whereas for blacks and Hispanics, they've been moving up, certainly, some parts of those populations, and there wasn't the, they believe there just wasn't the expectation that with every generation you're going to live better than your parents. They also, think what needs to be explored is they posit the idea that anti-poverty programs have been of more benefit to blacks, whereas whites might not have been able to benefit from them. Their, salaries might have been high enough so that they don't qualify.
Last but not least, one of the biggest stories today is the healthcare vote. We could be seeing some major changes for federal entitlement programs like Medicaid. Do you foresee those changes impacting mortality rates? Would that play a role in these trends?
Well, it really remains to see exactly what they do with the healthcare bill. But certainly, there are those estimates that millions of people could lose coverage or millions could qualify for coverage that is not as good as what they have now. A lot will depend on what happens with Medicaid, but potentially, yes, you could have a lot of people, including these people, working class whites, as well as blacks and Hispanics, losing coverage if the vote goes that way.
All right. Thank you, Betsy, for joining us.
Thank you.